This is lecture 3 in Introduction to Politics. As I mentioned in my first lecture, there are 4 main areas that a person can traverse and go if they're interested in politics in a broad sense. One is political theory or political philosophy. The other is comparative politics. Then there is international relations, international organizations, and the fourth would be a study of Canadian politics, the institutions, the charters, the history, parties, but also Canadian political philosophy as well. What I'd like to focus on today, and this would be part of your reading as well, is political ideology and political philosophy. As mentioned previously, we will tend to use the language of political studies because political studies best is an umbrella term that includes both the scientific element, for what it's worth, of politics and the element of political philosophy or political theory. So in political philosophy, there is often, it brings together the polis, and then philosophy, the love of wisdom. So what does it mean to think and live the wise life within the context of community, city, nations, international politics? So at the best, political philosophy attempts to think through the wisest and the best way by which humans can live together and how that is to be done. Needless to say, there are different ideas of how that should be done. And throughout the history of Western political philosophy, from Plato to Aristotle, Seneca, Cicero, Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, who should always be read alongside of, I think, Bonaventura, Meister Eckhart. These people are often ignored within the history of Western political thought. They're very important. Key women like Macrina, Paula, Hildegard, Brunhild. There's many great women who are also at the center. They're often omitted as if somehow feminism as a political theory only emerged with Mary Wollstonecraft and her works. And then often in the history of Western political theory, we often move forward to Machiavelli, who's very, very important in terms of the emergence of realism, sophisticated and subtle approach to realism. And then people like John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, moving forward, Burke is often studied, and Mill, John Rawls, Nozick. Interesting enough, when we look at these key thinkers, is they try and make sense of the individual, the community, the role of the state, the role of society, because the West has been more or less shaped by key Mediterranean European thinkers. What's often ignored in such a historic overview, and we do live increasingly so in a global village, is other political theories which are not a part of this Western intellectual tradition. And in our readings in the book, we'll be touching on the Confucian tradition, very important obviously in the Chinese heritage, the Analects, Confucius's understanding what constitutes the good life, the just life, the virtuous life, the role of family, the role of community, the role of the state in this. So a layered way of understanding the relationships between the individual, the family, the community, and the state. And so Confucian understanding of politics, obviously it's going to share certain affinities with other traditions. And then obviously since 9/11, in many books in political theory and political philosophy and political ideology, really up to a couple of decades ago, never really dealt with Islamic political thought. Certainly since 9/11, but much earlier, of course, as immigration has accelerated and increasingly more and more people have come from Muslim countries, whether Indonesia, Middle East, Northern Africa, they bring with them a tradition, some much more mature in their understanding of that tradition, others not as acutely aware of what the Muslim tradition is, of politics as embodied in the Quran and the Hadith and many other key texts of Islam, medieval Muslim thinkers on the relationship of the mosque and the state, and how that plays itself out. And the West has tended to experience some of the worst elements, or this is what the media, of course, will focus on, in terms of right-of-center jihadist forms of Islam, but there are also very moderate, thoughtful forms of Islam, as they have historically grappled with the relationship of mosque and state. And what is Sharia law? What role do the clerics have to play? What is jihad, not just as a political way of understanding, purifying Islam, but jihad as a spiritual overcoming of the sort of the dark sides within, the ego side within. And so when we think of political theory, to excessively focus on the West and its heritage in an age increasingly in which we are in touch with various and diverse political, ethnic, cultural traditions, is to have our head in the sand like an ostrich and not be aware of why people bring with them to liberal democratic societies different ways of understanding the sacred, the secular, and how they interpret that. And if people don't know that, then they become quite vulnerable in that sense to why particular more extreme groups act the way they do within a liberal democratic tradition, and how they justify what they do from certain reads of Confucian tradition or particular reads of the Quran and the Hadith and Sharia law and the various commentaries on that. And so key figures, say in 9/11, Sayyid Qutb and others, Muslim Brotherhood coming out of Egypt, Wahhabism coming out of Saudi Arabia, Taliban, Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab, not to understand these particular interpretations of Islam as then to be somewhat baffled by why certain women and men act on these. Now, the difference between ideology and political philosophy is also an important distinction to make, because often political philosophy, not necessarily so, but there is a tendency within political philosophy just to reflect on the diagnosis of what the issues are, offer a prognosis in theory, but not follow through. So what does this mean in action in terms of the practical application of thinking? So just as we go to a doctor when we're not doing well, there is a diagnosis, or diagnosis through knowledge. We look at what the issue was. So just as you have physicians of the body, there's physicians of the body politic as well. And then a good physician of the body, just as a physician of politics, offers a prognosis. So through knowledge, at the level of theory, the hope is that in following this advice, a healthy physical body will occur as well as a body politic will occur. Now, political philosophy or political theory often, but not always, lingers at the level of the diagnosis, prognosis. Ideology is as much concerned with, and this is where if you want to go a little, take deeper dives, take the course which is a complement to this course, Ideology in Politics. The word ideology comes from ideia and logos, and so ideology in politics is about what is the best way. Logos can mean many things in Greek. It has multiple meanings, anywhere from logic to reflection to the presencing of that which is. There's a variety of ways that logos, but we all have ideas about what we think. Ideia, ideology in politics. We all have ideas about what we think will bring about the good society. Logos, interpreted as, certainly in a more academic sense of ideology, or people thinking ideologically, is reflecting on those ideas. Are they likely to deliver the goods? What is the insights being offered? What might be the blind spots within any ideas we have as we reflect on them towards the good? But ideology is also about action. So the three spheres of ideology is the ideas we have upon reflection that we think properly diagnoses the problem, ideas that we have upon reflection that offers a prognosis, and that's what is the means that we're going to use to bring about that particular end of a just, a peaceful, and ecologically sane and sensible society. And so political ideology, and they need not be contrasted between political theory and political philosophy and ideology, but ideology tends to lean more in the direction of what's the relationship of theory to praxis, of praxis to theory. And so many of the important political philosophers also were very committed to political ideology because they were concerned with how their ideas were fleshed out in the trenches of economic questions and political questions and social questions and ecological questions and interpersonal issues. And as I mentioned earlier, then the key political philosophers we study in courses in political theory have thought deeply, and so the difference between a Plato and an Aristotle in terms of the role of the state, grassroots up politics versus state down politics. Plato would lean a little more in terms of the state playing a key role in shaping the role of citizens, and each knowing basically their gifts and the skills where they fit in. Aristotle has a much more of a leaning towards grassroots up politics, but it's not that they're either or, it's where do they lean in terms of their focus. And Augustine in his City of God is always asking the question, what's the relationship to ultimate visions that people have, whether it can be, obviously he's not arguing in Islamic context, but people coming from religious backgrounds, of some ultimate understanding of the divine and what that looks like in penultimate areas, which people have to make sense of themselves in communities. Should a state be the dominant force? Should the mosque, should the church, the synagogue, the temple, the gurdwara? People grappling with it. And Aquinas thinking the same thoughts. And then we move forward into a Machiavellian realism. And what's the difference between a Locke and a Hobbes in terms of the state of nature? If you have a negative view of the state of nature and a war of all against all, then inevitably you're going to want to have some sort of centralized sovereign who's going to minimize civil war and conflict and bring some sort of stability of peace. If a person's understanding of the state of nature is that just the goods cannot be provided as well and as consistently when people are alone and fragmented in a state of nature, things become much more efficient if people come together in communities in a contract with a government that is meant to provide much more efficient services for one and all. So Locke and Hobbes have very different understandings of why there is the state, the transient nature of the state, a contractual nature of the state. Rousseau, for example, with his general will, how does Rousseau hold together the relationship of the individual, their wants, their needs, their desires for purpose, meaning, and yet where do they fit within the general will of the community? We tend to often in the West overplay the individual, and this comes out of the Lockean tradition much more. And someone like Rousseau, even Hobbes in Leviathan, the role of the individual within the community, which is governed by the state, which brings security and peace and predictability. is very important. So Rousseau's Social Contract, some of his other works as well. And I mentioned earlier Mill. Also Karl Marx is very, very important to this. Karl Marx is coming out of what you call left-wing liberalism, which is high commitment, not only at an economic sphere, but to community and the role of the state as an interim means to bring justice, where historically certain people have more of the goods, the bourgeois, and the proletariat are the workers, the horses, the mules. And someone like Marx's thinking, which is very important, which plays itself in elements of the USSR, even though many pure Marxists would certainly argue very clear the USSR did not embody meaningful Marxist thought, or Mao's revolution in China, in terms of, once again, the workers, the peasants, and then the ruling Confucian elite, what was Mao Zedong in his Red Book getting at. So the different understandings of particularly the relationship of the state, of community and individuals, and economics is foundational to everything in this. He or she who does not have the economic goods or does not have access to them or does not have the ability to make them, they're in a different place entirely than those who do very well economically. So what is the role of the state and community in bridging what are obviously disparities, or what Dickens would call the tale of two cities, remembering that Marx lived in London in the 19th century, and the terrible working conditions of people in London at the time that Dickens and Disraeli described so well in novelistic forms, or Gaskell in North and South. And then Engels was up in Manchester, the workshop of the world in northern England, and again the workers, the treatment, the hours, the lack of benefits, the short life expectancy, pay. It's not that Marx and Engels, one can raise questions about some of their answers, but one can certainly not ignore their sensitivity to human sufferings in northern England, Liverpool, Manchester, Wigan, London. They describe aptly and well the disparity between a class society in which some live very well and others not at all. They're treated more like animals for the wealthy, who live in very comfortable living conditions. And so when we look at ideology and political philosophy, someone like a Karl Marx or an Engels are very important. But out of the critiques of, on the one hand, the dilemmas of laissez-faire liberalism that we get in Adam Smith, that talks about the wealth of nations, the dilemma of Smith, who often is seen as the father of capitalism. He's often distorted in the reading of him. He had a high view of the state as well. He just questioned to what degree should the state be involved in the market, and to what degree it should and it shouldn't. But the issue of a Smithian approach, the wealth of nations, of course, what Smith doesn't deal with in the wealth of nations is who has the wealth and who doesn't have the wealth. And so when we think GNP and GDP, it only measures generally wealth. It doesn't say who has the wealth and who doesn't. And someone like a Marx and an Engels come along and point out clearly that Smith may have articulated clearly, even though he is much more conscience-ridden than some make him to be. In fact, Marx argued that Smith's ideals were absolutely necessary in terms of the building up of an economy, which then would be taken over by the proletariat. So Smith was not contra, or Marx was not contra Smith. He merely pointed he was a necessary step in the process of the equalizing of one and all and bringing in the good community and finally the classless society itself. As a result of these elements, what seem to be two extremes, a certain read of right-wing capitalism and a minimizing and a weakening of the state and the market and laissez-faire On the other hand, a left-wing liberalism, which argues that liberty, meaningful liberty, can only be understood when all have that liberty, when all are treated equally. The left-wing form of liberalism, Marxism. Social liberalism, you get out of Keynesian economics, or Lord Beveridge in 1942 within England, arguing that between these two extremes, laissez-faire capitalism, it leads to immense inequities and inequalities, liberty for some, but not liberty for many. And the Marxist solution that the state has to intervene, own the means of production, so that the freedom of each and all can only be recognized when all are free from the toils of labor in the economic sphere. This highly collectivist understanding of the common good versus the competitive individualist. Within political theory in the West, this is where we get social liberalism or welfare liberalism emerges, an attempt to say, yes, the leftist understanding of the role of the state in the economy and the role of the state in universal health care, employment insurance, working conditions, wage, affordable education, the state should play a role in that. But also individuals have to use their liberty, all being equal in good conscience as they see fit, with the goods that they have been given. It's not the role of the state to produce equality of outcome, but it is there to prepare the conditions for which people, if they use them wisely and well, can use their liberty, all being equal in good conscience, to live a good life within the context of family, community, and Canada, province, nation, and Canada in international relations as a peacemaking state at its best. Obviously at its worst it plays with the rhetoric of that without the substance of that. So the middle way, or the via media, that many Western countries, depending on where they stand, obviously the United States is more to the right on those sort of questions. Canada is Canada's often torn between the American tradition of the market economy, lighter state, the role of the individual shaping and forming their own destiny, and more of a European model, a British model, in which the state plays a significant role in the economy, in social services, in providing goods for citizens. So Canada is in this middle way between being drawn into the gravitational field of the United States and yet resisting it, also given our heritage in the Euro-British tradition as well. If you go further to the left, obviously certain northern Scandinavian countries, Norway, Sweden, Holland, they go further down that leftist tradition in terms of social democracy or democratic socialism. And these leftist traditions were answers to various forms of Marxist communism, pointing out there was obviously good in these traditions, and this was their attempt to answer it in a less perhaps repressive and oppressive manner. But they also saw the pitfalls of the market economy and unrestrained competition and the impact on many people without some sort of a statist intervention. So political philosophy, political ideology, and then the implications of that in terms of what makes a good state. And then we'll be moving on in this course, now that I've briefly touched on political philosophy, some of the thinkers, some of the issues back of the thinkers, into the nuts and bolts of how governments work and their different understandings of how they're to work based on underlying roots of political philosophy and political ideology.